I am so excited to have one of my good friends, Dr. Richard Matthew, with us this morning. If you'll go to page 14, I believe, his resume is on there, so I don't want to reiterate it, but he's a professor at UCI, works with the Blum Center, he works with the United Nations, he's traveled the world, he's had 4 or 5 TED Talks, I don't know. We are really, really, really honored to have you here this morning, Richard.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Actually, I baptized Richard's 3 children here at one point in 2014, maybe?
Yep.
And they consider this their church. He travels so much, we get to see him this morning. We had to arrange it for Earth Day, and I'm obviously excited, so thank you.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to have Dr. Matthews here this morning because I think that we're seeing more and more on climate change, and our program for Lent was so cut short last year. Richard was going to be one of our guest speakers, so I invited him this year. And I think we're getting to a crucial point, and Richard was telling me there's a new report out that the word was grim. And I said, well, we have to have some hope too. So why don't you give us a little bit of what you're doing and where you're going at UCI and all your festivities that you're doing. You're doing so much work around the world.
Yeah, sure. I love to share what we're doing. One of the things that we're really focused on, the biggest challenge, natural disaster facing the planet is flooding. And but 1 out of 2 people on the planet are affected by floods. Right. The country that experiences the highest level of damage is the US. And for a very long time, we've been working with very coarse tools to manage flood risk. And so we get what's happened in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and Louisiana. And we have been working over the past decade or more to build really, really fine resolution models. So imagine a model which is extremely accurate, very fine resolution of Orange County and LA County, we've done both, that's hydro-conditioned, so we know how water is drained and so on. And then we pour water in. We pour water in to emulate what happened in, we're all living in a major flood zone here, by the way. And the huge floods, the devastating floods in Southern California took place in 1862 and 1938. And since that time, we've built up this big defense system. Well, we replicate those, and we look at what would happen today. And it gives a really, really fine sense of a much more efficient and economical way of managing that risk. And coarse tools led to hugely expensive solutions. When you have very fine-grained tools, you can have much more targeted solutions. And then we look also at what might happen, what's the worst that could happen here. And we sort of build solutions. And we've taken that and we now have built models for in Malawi and Bangladesh and Paraguay. So the things that we learned here in Southern California, we've taken around the world, Mexico, and they're being used by planners, emergency responders, homeowners, to develop to make decisions about what do we need to do in LA during a major flood. So that's a big focus of our work.
Yeah, and one time you told me that it's some pretty low-tech solutions, actually.
There are a lot of things that can be done. For example, we have when California started to develop, really in the middle of the 19th century. And we had the gold rush and all of a sudden flow of people, and we had a huge flood event here. It stretched from the ocean into San Bernardino and Riverside counties. The entire area of Orange County was underwater for weeks. And we began to build defenses against that. But we also had to bring water into people. So we were building flood defenses, we were bringing water in, we were building huge ports, so we expanded beaches. We were building transportation systems. So we stopped things like the movement of sediment, which would naturally replenish our beaches. We broke down sand dunes, which provide a lot of defense so that people could have better views and so on. Well, that's been a mistake. We will lose all our beaches right now, nothing to do with climate change so much as the fact that there's no nourishment to them. The sediment is all trapped. Instead of coming down like it would, it's all trapped. So there are these sort of cheaper ways of building defenses, protecting our beaches, protecting ourselves from flooding, which we distorted and interrupted back, especially after World War II, when the country was very wealthy. We had a ton of money, and we built a lot of infrastructure. So we built big, heavy infrastructure. And that's a problem. It distorted natural processes, And by the way, now it's 70 years old, most of it,
Yeah.
and it's cracking and it's falling apart. And so we've built a lot of value in the shadow of very, very old flood defense.
Mm-hmm. And so your recent projects are local, or are you simultaneously doing these across the country?
We're doing them around the world.
Right.
Our goal is to model the entire southern part of the United States because it's extremely vulnerable.
Right.
But we've also got two big projects in Bangladesh, a huge project in Malawi, another one in Paraguay, a couple in Mexico.
Interesting. So you've also done a lot with people that have faced war and natural disasters, and
Yeah.
I think I was with you one time when you did a TED Talk on the aspect of war and what's going on in different parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, so I've been involved in environmental peace building for a long
Right.
time, which looks at the ways in which environmental change aggravates social conditions that are vulnerable to war, and then what happens to the environment during war, and then when you come out of a war,
Yeah.
what sort of things you need to do, because usually agriculture and water and energy have all been destroyed during the war.
Exactly.
So it's hugely expensive, and you want to rebuild. There's never enough money to rebuild properly. So you really have to get a clear sense. So I was a peace builder in Rwanda and Congo and Sierra Leone, and again, you want to get a real sense of what the situation is, help work with the local community to devise priorities, and then look for the most efficient types of solutions, and that's what we do now. And again, I'm heavily involved in the peace building activities, but the past year has been, we haven't been able to travel or do anything.
With the pandemic.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that Richard traveled with me to Swaziland and brought his family, and actually did a study in Swaziland with the orphan children. And so your students are heavily involved with all these studies, and I'm sure they're doing doctorates and whatnot.
Yeah.
But I found it really interesting how studies are done over time. It's very, very well run. You can't take any students with you, so how have you been doing any studies during the pandemic?
So we have teams in each of our sites that are local teams. And so we've been able to work with them, but we haven't been able to go and visit them. Typically, in a typical year, my center would fund about somewhere in the order of 60 to 100 people to go to these sites. And so last year we didn't send anybody.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I thought it was really interesting this morning that the gospel message was, the disciples not believing Jesus had risen from the dead. Prove it, prove it. So I thought it was just kind of segue right into what about the climate change non-believers? What would you say to them, and how would you respond? That there are people that still feel that this is really, overblown.
I mean, I think that from my perspective, there's a couple of problems. And I don't blame people who deny climate change for their position. I think that the bigger problem is with journalists and with lobbyists and with our elected officials who have taken an issue and simplified it in a way which is unrealistic. And then they've packaged a whole lot together. And you either have to buy into the whole package or you are a denier. To me, that's not the way to think of climate change. If we think of climate change from a very scientific perspective, right, the very first thing, it is just a statistical change in weather patterns. And unless you disagree with our measures of temperature and rainfall, and very few people disagree with that, then climate change is happened. That is, the weather today is on average 1.8 degrees warmer than it was 100 years ago. Sea level has risen about 6 inches, and so on. Okay, so there's no controversy about that. There's nobody I know who knows anything about it who denies that. When we move to the next question, what's caused that? We have had an awful lot of work looking at it, looking at changes in the Earth's orbit and changes in solar radiation and changes in things like volcanic activity and changes in the Earth's wobble and so on. And what thousands and thousands of scientists around the world have come to the conclusion is that a significant part of it is being driven by cutting down forests and putting greenhouse gases. That's not very controversial, unless you want to reject all of science. And I don't know how many people would say, if you had your 9-year-old daughter and she was, had a fever and was throwing up and so on, would say, let me ask people in Congress to diagnose her, or let me turn to some talking head
Right.
on CNN to diagnose her.
Right.
You'd probably go to a doctor, right?
Right.
Now, when it comes to the next question, what does this mean? How does it? There's a lot more uncertainty there. That's where our public debate should be taking place. Because if you look at something like Orange County, 6 inches of sea level rise, and the average warming in California, 3 degrees Fahrenheit over the past,
Right.
it's not very much. And it doesn't explain a lot of we had 3 million acres of forest burn in the 1990s, 7 million in the 2000s, 10 million in the past decade. Is that because of climate change? Climate change is a factor, but there's a lot of terms that has to do with forest management.
Right.
What about our flood exposure here? I mean, climate change is a factor, but we have a flood defense. We built in a very hydrologically sensitive area. We put tons of people in here, and people are living under dams that are about to fail. Mm-hmm. The American Society of Civil Engineers rated infrastructure in our country as a D. That is the grade above mass failure. Right. So we invested heavily in the 1950s into this, and we have been very timid as a country, again, no empirical reason why, to invest in it again. So take climate change out of the equation, we would still be facing massive forest fires and huge flood events in this country, and California would be extremely vulnerable. Climate change is an aggravator, right? So it's part of it. There's some uncertainty about how, but we know it's happening, and we know it needs to be factored in. When it comes to what we should do, this is what democracy is all about, talking about what we really value and what we want to invest in and what we don't.
Right.
If somebody said to, Arctic ice is melting. It's going to affect indigenous peoples. Is this a value of ours to try and preserve their way of life or to move them? We're going to look at what it costs and what the options are and what they would prefer and so on, and we're going to make decisions. We should be having those discussions, not whether the science is robust. The science is as robust as any science we have. But in terms of what it all means to us and what we should do about it, those are fruitful discussions. And those are where I find when you move people into those areas, doesn't matter whether they're conservative or liberal, they can all sort of see, they all understand that our society faces options and we have values that we want to be reflected in our public policy. And our politicians really have locked a lot of our country into a type of gridlock by sort of saying it's you either accept all of this on gun control or none of it, right. All of this on immigration or none of it. Right. Well, the world is full of uncertainty and ambiguity and difference.
It's not black and white.
It just isn't. And we shouldn't be presented with choices that are simply false dichotomies.
Right. And back to your infrastructure, I think, as a general contractor myself, there's always this kind of mentality, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. And so you see these bridges and I actually can drive by and see things like, yeah, that doesn't look good, the cracks so I think people, we have to be more active in our legislator and write or whatever, because they're not contractors and they're not scientists. They're
Exactly.
thinking they're representing the people. So I always try to say, write your Congress people. So what is your greatest fear for your children, your 3 children?
I mean, I think that the broad trends that were identified in the 1990s about nature loss and about climate change, and scientists at that time said, these are alarming, we need to think through them carefully, we're on a trajectory that is not promising. 30 years later, we are still on that trajectory. So we have not made any gains at all. And that, I think, is alarming because, the evidence is getting greater and greater, right. And we're doing so little. And there was a time in our country when Republicans and Democrats came together around things like clean water and clean air and these sorts of things and said these are public goods and we should do what we can. We might disagree on how much regulation, how much market, how much this, how much that, but we need to provide those. Well, we haven't come together around that. And I think that now we look forward and we say it's only going to get more and more expensive. And what we're going to see is enormous pressure on the equatorial belt. Like it or not, the Sahara Desert is growing very rapidly. Mm-hmm. It's expanded by 8% in the past 50 years. The massive amount of ice in the Arctic is melting. That's a fact. Mm-hmm. And so these things are eventually going to become really, really costly to manage. And there's so many low-hanging fruit. There's so many win-win situations when it doesn't matter who you are. If you believe in health, we all breathe air and drink water and eat food. And if you believe in human health, then there are areas where we could all agree on. And those are the areas that's most frustrating that we've done nothing on. So I do worry that my kids are going to inherit bigger problems than they need to inherit.
Yeah, I think we all do. So there's a sheet in the bulletin that says things you can do, and I kind of popped this question into you at the last minute. It seems like we can recycle. That's about the amount of plastic my household used in a week.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. So we can recycle, we can do all these, but I take it you feel like we can do all these things and they're great, but it's basically the politics of it and the willpower. Or do you think that individuals can make a difference?
Oh, I think individuals can do a lot. I think that if I look around at signs of hope, people are tremendously creative. They're intelligent. People themselves understand if they've raised kids or they've started a business. They understand uncertainty and ambiguity, and there are different ways you can go, different stresses and shocks. People understand that. And there are certain things that we know just make no sense. Waste, for example. Waste is just bad. It's bad for our health, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for our economy, and yet we generate an enormous amount of waste. Right. Food waste, plastic waste, trash. We have literally mountains and mountains of waste. Well, there's really huge benefits for our country. Mm-hmm. Household savings, national savings, better environment by reducing the waste stream. And everybody has a role that they can play in their home and in their business that way. We also, there are easy ways for us to do things that make sense, to reduce energy use and to reduce the pressure on our transportation systems and those sort of things. I think that we have to take seriously the deep, deep concerns of Generation Z. They have been raised being told that we're on the verge of an existential catastrophe. They're showing massively high levels of anxiety. It's the most suicidal generation in history. And we are not playing our role in helping to make these problems much more manageable, because they can be made much more manageable if we stop making them so black and white. If we show, well, we've got lots of options, there are things that we can do. Instead, we're terrifying a large part of our youth, terrifying them.
Right, and you're dealing with a lot of them at UCI.
So there's no reason for them to be this afraid based on the statements made by people who really know nothing about the science. Right. And that's journalists, and that's people on television shows, and that's our elected officials. Right. So I do see a big problem in those regards. So I think there's things we should be doing, like reducing waste. We need to help Generation Z grow up feeling sort of confident. Yeah. And I think we need to hold the people who run the country to a higher standard, and stop thinking that all policy matters are either basket A or basket B. Democracy is about saying, okay, there's some good ideas here, some good ideas on both sides. Right. And conservatives and liberals both have some good ideas and lots of bad ideas. Yeah. And we need to pull those good ideas out and move the country forward.
Right. I kind of forewarned you. How does your faith play in your role in this whole sector of climate change and what you're doing? I mean,
I think that I was one of those people who very young read the whole Bible a couple of times. And lines like, early in the Bible where there's sort of this advice, maybe, this requirement that we cultivate and care for creation. That's what we're supposed to be doing, cultivating and caring for it. And I interpret that in a sort of comprehensive sense. We need to cultivate sort of our own moral integrity and our own moral being. Mm-hmm. We need to care for other people. We need to show compassion, and when we have the capacity, help people. But we also need to cultivate and care for this broader environment that we're part of. And I think that in doing that well, science is, a tremendous support system for that, because it's hard to understand the world just intuitively. We get lots of advice from the Bible and other sources about caring for people and being good. Mm-hmm. We don't get so much on dealing with weather or these sorts of things, right? Managing water systems, managing energy systems. But science has emerged to help us fill that gap. And science today is I think the way it actually operates, the way it assigns confidence and uncertainty, is very compelling, and it's lost in a lot of the popular discussion. Mm-hmm. Scientists are not stupid. They understand certain things very well, and they know when they don't understand it, and they know when another type of knowledge, when it has to do with values and what we want,
ethics,
it needs to be looked at.
Right.
So I would say that, I think that cultivating and caring for things is critically important. I built my life around that in a way.
That's serving.
And I think I think that science is one stream of information into that, which helps us answer certain types of questions.
Right. I was telling Richard before the service that the Episcopal Church has really never moved out of the house of science and has always embraced it. So that's one of the distinct things, I think, that there's so many loud voices out there that I'm just really proud to say that we're here today, because we kind of embrace the fact that we have a duty to do through our Christian ethic and our morals. And so thank you for answering that. So where do we go from here? I want to know if do you see a bright shining star? What do you see as hope for the world?
I mean, honestly, I have what astronauts call a sort of orbital perspective.
Yeah.
For me, the planet, this creation is incredibly beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's awe-inspiring. It is also, when you look at it the way I do, it's a shared space. Mm-hmm. We don't own, the ownership of it is arbitrary. It's a shared space. When you look at it, we are this little tiny thing in this vast darkness, and it's a shared space. And I think to me, there's lots and lots of people around our country and around the world who keep sort of reaffirming the beauty and the integrity and the ingenuity of humankind. Mm-hmm. But I do believe there are gatekeepers who have made it difficult for us to make progress on important issues. Poverty is one of them. Homelessness is another. And I think that a lot of the reasons we haven't made progress on homelessness or on poverty or on, and we've really made no progress on poverty, or on climate change, does have to do with leadership that has not been willing to act according to the deeper values of the country, which are values of tolerance, mm-hmm. and respect for different opinions, mm-hmm. and the ability to use common sense, right. and the ability to use evidence to make decisions. And we have moved away from it as if some stream of anecdotes and personal feelings are enough to run the country. Mm-hmm. So I have lots of optimism and confidence in humankind and in the American people. Honestly, I have very little in leadership today. Yeah.
Yeah, I always go back to the fact that I have a lot of confidence in humankind, and that, above all, when the chips are down, people do rise to the occasion, I believe. So that's...
People have just endless amounts of courage, yeah. resilience, and ingenuity, right. and we need to activate the deeper wisdom, mm-hmm. and the passion of the American people.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us this morning. I have a gift for you.
Oh, wow.
There's another book for you to read. I can imagine you probably don't read much, but thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.